In the fluorescent-lit Millbrook Community Center, a 72-year-old retired librarian was about to challenge the most powerful family in town. What started as a routine town hall meeting took a shocking turn when she came face-to-face with decades of buried corruption. Eleanor Hartwell wasn't your typical concerned citizen. For 45 years, she had cataloged the town's history, known for her methodical precision and encyclopedic knowledge. When she encountered Marcus Drake's dismissive silencing, she had no idea she was walking into a web of environmental cover-ups and murder. Eleanor's quiet determination would lead to exposing crimes that had poisoned her community for decades. What began as public humiliation would become a relentless investigation that toppled the town's power structure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in Millbrook's Community Center cast harsh shadows across the rows of folding chairs, most of them occupied by residents who had come to voice their opinions about the proposed renovation project. Eleanor Hartwell sat in the third row, her weathered hands gripping a manila folder thick with historical documents and photocopied maps. At 72, she had attended enough town meetings to know when something didn't smell right about a proposal, and the community center renovation reeked of hidden agendas. Marcus Drake commanded the front of the room with the practiced ease of someone born to power. His tailored suit and confident smile spoke of a man who had never doubted his right to be heard, never questioned whether his voice mattered. As town council president, he presided over the meeting with the kind of casual authority that came from 3 generations of political influence in Millbrook. "The renovation will bring our community center into the 21st century, Marcus was saying, his voice carrying easily through the room without amplification. "Modern facilities, updated technology, expanded capacity for our growing population. This is about progress, about investing in our future." Eleanor's grip tightened on her folder. She had spent the better part of a week cross-referencing the proposed plans with historical records, property surveys, and old town maps. What she had discovered made her stomach turn. The cheerful architectural renderings Marcus displayed on the screen showed a gleaming new facility, but they conveniently omitted crucial details about what would be demolished to make room for it. When Marcus opened the floor for public comment, Eleanor stood slowly, her knees protesting after sitting for nearly an hour. The whispered conversations around her died as she made her way to the microphone at the front of the room. She recognized many faces in the audience: former library patrons, longtime residents, people whose families she had helped research at the Historical Society. But their expressions were polite, distant, the kind of look people gave to elderly women who took up too much time at public meetings. "Thank you, Mr. Drake," Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I've had a chance to review the renovation plans, and I have some concerns about the historical impact." "Mrs. Hartwell," Marcus interrupted smoothly, his smile never wavering. "I appreciate your interest in this project, but I think we should focus on the future benefits, rather than getting bogged down in the past." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "If I may finish, Mr. Drake, according to my research, the proposed site includes not only the current community center, but also the old Hartwell Cemetery, which dates back to 1847. This is a protected historical site under Mrs. Hartwell." Marcus's voice carried a note of patient condescension that made Eleanor's jaw clench. "I understand that as our former librarian you have a particular attachment to old records. But we have teams of professional architects and planners working on this project. I'm sure they've considered all relevant factors." The dismissal was clear, but Eleanor pressed on. "The cemetery contains the graves of 17 of Millbrook's founding families, including my late husband Robert. The plans show construction directly over, ma'am." Marcus stepped closer to the podium, his presence suddenly imposing. "I think it's time we moved on to other community members who want to speak." Eleanor's voice rose slightly. "You cannot simply bulldoze over our history. These graves contain people who built this town, who—" Marcus reached over and switched off her microphone. The electronic pop echoed through the suddenly silent room. Eleanor's mouth moved, but no sound emerged from the speakers. She looked out at the audience, seeing a mixture of embarrassment and discomfort on their faces. No one met her eyes. "I think," Marcus said, his voice now carrying a harder edge, "it's time for the older generation to step aside and let those of us who understand modern needs handle the future of our community. Old people should stay quiet and let the younger generation handle the future." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Around her, she could hear shuffling feet, cleared throats, the rustle of papers, the sound of people looking anywhere but at her. She stood at the microphone for a long moment, her face burning with humiliation, before walking slowly back to her seat. The meeting continued around her, but Eleanor heard none of it. Marcus's words echoed in her mind. Old people should stay quiet. She thought of Robert's grave, unmarked on the official plans. She thought of the 17 families whose final resting places would be disturbed for a building that could easily be constructed elsewhere. She thought of 45 years spent serving this community, preserving its history, only to be dismissed as irrelevant. After the meeting ended, Eleanor remained in her seat as the crowd filed out. She watched Marcus shake hands with supporters, saw him laugh with the developers, noticed how carefully he avoided looking in her direction. The man who had just publicly humiliated her was now playing the part of the gracious public servant, accepting congratulations on his handling of the meeting. Ruby Washington approached her chair cautiously. At 68, Ruby had been Eleanor's closest friend since their children attended school together 3 decades ago. Her dark eyes showed concern mixed with something Eleanor recognized as fear. "Eleanor, honey," Ruby said quietly, "maybe you should just let this go." Eleanor looked up at her friend, seeing the genuine worry in her expression. "Let it go? Ruby, they're going to desecrate Robert's grave. They're going to destroy 17 families' burial sites. And they didn't even have the decency to mention it in their presentation." I know. Ruby glanced around nervously. "But Marcus Drake. His family has run this town for longer than either of us has been alive. You saw what happened up there. You think crossing him is going to end well?" Eleanor stood slowly, her folder clutched against her chest. "I think," she said, her voice carrying a new steel that made Ruby step back slightly, "that I've been quiet long enough." Ruby caught her arm gently. "Eleanor, please. My grandson Jerome works for the city planning department. If you start making waves..." "Then maybe it's time for some waves," Eleanor replied. She looked around the emptying room, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just about a cemetery anymore. This was about power, about who had the right to speak, about whose voice mattered in a community. For the first time in the 5 years since Robert's death, Eleanor felt truly awake. The fog of grief and irrelevance that had surrounded her lifted, replaced by something she hadn't felt in decades: purpose. As she walked toward the exit, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. She would not stay quiet. She would not step aside. And she would not let Marcus Drake or anyone else erase the history of Millbrook without a fight. The investigation would begin tonight. The investigation began in Eleanor's home study at 11:47 p.m., exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes after Marcus Drake had silenced her microphone. The room bore the organized chaos of a lifetime dedicated to preserving knowledge. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filing cabinets stood sentinel in every corner, and bankers' boxes labeled with decades of dates created neat towers throughout the space. This was where Eleanor had continued her work after retirement, digitizing Millbrook's historical records and maintaining the unofficial archive that the town had never bothered to fund properly. She spread the community center renovation plans across her oak desk, the same desk where she had once helped countless residents trace their family histories. The architectural drawings looked innocent enough in the lamplight: clean lines, modern materials, expanded parking. But Eleanor's trained eye caught what others had missed: the subtle discrepancies between the official property boundaries and the actual historical land use. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency through the filing system she had developed over 4 decades. Property deeds from the 1800s, surveyor maps from the early 1900s, newspaper clippings from every significant event in Millbrook's history. Each document had been cataloged, cross-referenced, and preserved against the day when someone might need to know the truth about their town's past. The first anomaly emerged when she compared the 1847 cemetery plat with the current renovation site plan. The official documents showed the cemetery as a small, contained area near the back of the property. But the original surveyor's map revealed something different. The burial ground had once extended nearly twice as far, encompassing what was now the main parking lot and part of the existing community center. Eleanor's laptop hummed quietly as she scanned documents into digital files, her surprisingly tech-savvy skills allowing her to cross-reference information in ways that would have been impossible even a decade ago. Robert had always teased her about her embrace of new technology, saying she was the most digitally advanced librarian in the county. The memory brought a brief smile before she refocused on the task at hand. At 1:23 a.m., she found the first thread that would unravel everything. Buried in a 1987 newspaper clipping about the proposed community center construction was a brief mention of the Millbrook Manufacturing Company, a small factory that had occupied the site in the 1980s. The factory had burned down in a devastating fire that killed 3 workers, and the site had been purchased by the town shortly afterward for the community center project. The fog of grief and irrelevance that had surrounded her lifted, replaced by something she hadn't felt in decades: purpose. As she walked toward the exit, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. She would not stay quiet. She would not step aside. And she would not let Marcus Drake or anyone else erase the history of Millbrook without a fight. The investigation would begin tonight. The investigation began in Eleanor's home study at 11:47 p.m., exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes after Marcus Drake had silenced her microphone. The room bore the organized chaos of a lifetime dedicated to preserving knowledge. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filing cabinets stood sentinel in every corner, and bankers' boxes labeled with decades of dates created neat towers throughout the space. This was where Eleanor had continued her work after retirement, digitizing Millbrook's historical records and maintaining the unofficial archive that the town had never bothered to fund properly. She spread the community center renovation plans across her oak desk, the same desk where she had once helped countless residents trace their family histories. The architectural drawings looked innocent enough in the lamplight: clean lines, modern materials, expanded parking. But Eleanor's trained eye caught what others had missed: the subtle discrepancies between the official property boundaries and the actual historical land use. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency through the filing system she had developed over 4 decades. Property deeds from the 1800s, surveyor maps from the early 1900s, newspaper clippings from every significant event in Millbrook's history. Each document had been cataloged, cross-referenced, and preserved against the day when someone might need to know the truth about their town's past. The first anomaly emerged when she compared the 1847 cemetery plat with the current renovation site plan. The official documents showed the cemetery as a small, contained area near the back of the property. But the original surveyor's map revealed something different. The burial ground had once extended nearly twice as far, encompassing what was now the main parking lot and part of the existing community center. Eleanor's laptop hummed quietly as she scanned documents into digital files, her surprisingly tech-savvy skills allowing her to cross-reference information in ways that would have been impossible even a decade ago. Robert had always teased her about her embrace of new technology, saying she was the most digitally advanced librarian in the county. The memory brought a brief smile before she refocused on the task at hand. At 1:23 a.m., she found the first thread that would unravel everything. Buried in a 1987 newspaper clipping about the proposed community center construction was a brief mention of the Millbrook Manufacturing Company, a small factory that had occupied the site in the 1980s. The factory had burned down in a devastating fire that killed 3 workers, and the site had been purchased by the town shortly afterward for the community center project. "Why are you calling me at 3 in the morning about something that happened almost 40 years ago?" "Because it's not ancient history. It's happening again, right now, with this community center renovation. Grace, I have documents that show the Drake family knew about the safety violations before the fire. They knew people were going to die, and they did nothing." Another pause. "What kind of documents?" Eleanor described her findings, hearing Grace's breathing change as the implications became clear. When she finished, Grace was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor, do you understand what you're suggesting? You're talking about multiple felonies, wrongful death, environmental cover-up. This isn't just about disrespecting a cemetery. I know exactly what I'm suggesting, Eleanor replied. The question is whether you're willing to help me prove it. Grace's laugh was bitter. You know what happened the last time I tried to investigate the Drake family? I lost my job, my reputation, everything. They have ways of making troublemakers disappear. That was then. This is now. And this time, we have documentation they thought was buried forever. The line went quiet again. Eleanor could hear Grace moving around, could almost picture her pacing in her apartment, wrestling with old demons and new possibilities. If I do this, Grace said finally, there's no going back. Once we start down this path, we're going to make enemies of some very powerful people. Grace. 3 people died in that fire. Their families never got justice. Robert and 16 other souls are about to have their graves desecrated to cover up evidence of environmental contamination. How many more people are going to suffer while we worry about making enemies? When Grace spoke again, her voice carried a resolve that Eleanor recognized from their younger days. What do you need from me? I need you to help me find Vincent Rossini. He was the foreman on the demolition crew after the fire. If anyone knows what really happened to the evidence, it's him. Vinnie Rossini. Yeah, I remember him. Gruff old guy, worked construction for 40 years. He's got to be in his 80s now if he's still alive. Eleanor was already pulling up contact information on her computer. He's alive. Lives alone on Elm Street since his wife died 2 years ago. I think he's been waiting for someone to ask him the right questions. As she hung up the phone, Eleanor felt the weight of what she was starting. This wasn't just about preserving history or protecting a cemetery. This was about exposing a conspiracy that had shaped Millbrook for decades, a web of corruption and cover-up that had cost lives and would cost more if left unchallenged. She looked at the documents spread across her desk, each one a piece of evidence in a case that could bring down the most powerful family in town. For the first time since Robert's death, Eleanor felt truly alive. The invisible, irrelevant old woman who had been dismissed at the town meeting was gone. In her place stood someone who knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. The methodical investigation that would define the next chapter of Eleanor's life had begun. And Marcus Drake had no idea what was coming for him. Vincent Rossini's house on Elm Street spoke of a man who had once taken pride in his work, but had long since stopped caring about appearances. The small bungalow's paint was peeling, the front porch sagged slightly under the weight of accumulated years, and the yard showed the kind of neglect that came from having no one left to impress. Eleanor knocked on the screen door at 2:30 p.m. the following day, her manila folder tucked under her arm like a shield. The man who answered bore little resemblance to the robust construction foreman she remembered from decades past. Vinnie Rossini had shrunk into himself, his shoulders curved inward as if carrying an invisible burden. His weathered hands shook slightly as he gripped the door frame, and his eyes held the particular wariness of someone who had spent too many years looking over his shoulder. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly, heard you caused quite a stir at the town meeting. What brings you to my door? Eleanor had rehearsed this moment during the sleepless hours after her call with Grace. She knew she had one chance to gain Vinnie's trust, one opportunity to convince him that keeping silent was no longer an option. I need to talk to you about the factory fire, Vinnie, about what really happened after. The change in his expression was immediate and profound. The wariness deepened into something approaching fear, and his grip on the doorframe tightened until his knuckles went white. Don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. That was a long time ago. Eleanor pulled out one of the documents from her folder, a work order from the demolition company, dated 3 weeks after the fire, with Vinnie's signature clearly visible at the bottom. I have the paperwork, Vinnie. I know you were the foreman on the cleanup crew. I know you were there when they cleared the site. For a moment, she thought he might slam the door in her face. Instead, he stepped back and gestured for her to enter, his movements carrying the resignation of a man who had been expecting this conversation for 37 years. The inside of the house was neat but sparse, decorated with the kind of careful minimalism that spoke of someone who had learned to live with very little. A single photograph sat on the mantel, a younger Vinny with a woman who must have been his wife, both of them smiling at some long-ago family gathering. "Coffee?" he asked, moving toward the kitchen with the careful steps of someone whose joints had been worn down by decades of hard labor. "Please." Eleanor settled into a chair at the small dining table, giving him time to process her presence and gather his thoughts. She had learned in her years as a librarian that sometimes the most important conversations required patience. Vinny returned with 2 mismatched mugs, his hands steadier now that he had something to do. He sat across from her, his eyes focused on the coffee rather than her face. "You don't know what you're asking," he said quietly. "You don't know what kind of people you're dealing with." Eleanor spread the documents across the table, watching his eyes widen as he recognized forms, reports, and photographs he hadn't seen in decades. "I know that 3 people died in that fire. I know that safety violations were documented and ignored. And I know that evidence was destroyed during the cleanup." Vinny's laugh was bitter. "Evidence? Yeah, there was evidence. Drums of chemicals that should have been disposed of properly years before the fire. Structural modifications that violated every safety code in the book. Documentation that proved the owners knew exactly what they were doing. What happened to it?" He looked up at her then, and Eleanor saw the weight of 37 years of guilt in his eyes. "We buried it. Literally. Along with contaminated soil, damaged equipment, anything that might have pointed to negligence. The Drake family, Marcus's grandfather, he paid us to make sure the site was clean before the town took it over." Eleanor felt her heart racing, but she kept her voice steady. "Where?" "Under the community center. Under the parking lot. Hell, under half the downtown area. We spread that contaminated soil all over town, mixed it with clean-filled dirt, and told everyone it was safe." His hands were shaking again. "3 men died, Mrs. Hartwell. 3 good men who just wanted to make a living. And we helped cover it up." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of decades-old secrets. Eleanor could hear the tick of a clock from somewhere in the house, marking time that had been stolen from the families of those who died. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why did you agree to do it?" Vinny's face crumpled slightly. "Because I was young and stupid, and they offered me more money than I'd ever seen. Because they said it would be better for everyone if the whole thing just went away quietly. Because I had a wife and 2 kids and a mortgage, and they made it very clear what would happen if I didn't cooperate." "What kind of threats?" "The kind that make you understand that some secrets are worth more than your life." He gestured around the small house. "You think I've been living like this by choice? They've been paying me to stay quiet for 37 years. Not much, but enough to keep me comfortable as long as I don't cause trouble." Quote. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice gentle but insistent. "Vinny, those payments aren't protection, they're chains. And now they're about to disturb that contaminated soil again with this renovation project. How many more people are going to be exposed to whatever you buried?" "I've thought about that every day for 37 years, he whispered. "Every time I read about someone in town getting sick, every time I heard about cancer clusters or birth defects, I wondered if it was because of what we did." Eleanor reached across the table and covered his shaking hands with hers. "It's not too late to make it right. You don't understand. My daughter still lives here. My grandchildren go to school here. If I talk, if I testify, they'll make sure my family pays the price. The Drakes don't just destroy the people who cross them. They destroy everyone connected to them. And if you don't talk, if this renovation proceeds and more people get sick, what happens to your grandchildren then?" Vinny pulled his hands away and stood up, pacing to the window that looked out over his neglected yard. "There's something else. Something I've never told anyone." Eleanor waited, sensing that this was the moment that would define everything that followed. "The night before the fire, I was working late at the factory. I saw Marcus Drake Sr. there, talking to the owner. They didn't know I was there, but I heard them discussing insurance payouts, about how much the property would be worth if the factory was gone. He turned back to face her. Mrs. Hartwell, I don't think that fire was an accident. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her, understanding that what she had uncovered was far worse than simple negligence or cover-up. You're saying they deliberately caused the fire? I'm saying they knew it was going to happen. Whether they caused it or just let it happen, I don't know. But they were prepared for it. Too prepared. Eleanor stood and moved to stand beside him at the window. Vinny, if that's true, then this isn't just about environmental contamination or safety violations. This is about murder. I know what it is, he said quietly. I've been living with it for 37 years. They stood in silence for a long moment, both of them staring out at the ordinary suburban street that concealed such extraordinary secrets. Will you help me? Eleanor asked finally. Will you help me prove what really happened? Vinny was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. If I do this, there's no going back. They'll come after me, after my family. They'll make sure we pay for every word I speak. And if you don't do it, 3 men will have died for nothing. And more people will die when they disturb that contaminated soil. He turned to look at her, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a flicker of the man he had been before 37 years of guilt and fear had worn him down. I'll need protection, legal protection, and I'll need someone who understands the law to help me figure out how to do this without getting killed. Eleanor nodded. I know someone, a judge who's been carrying his own burden from this case. Someone who might be willing to help us both find redemption. As she prepared to leave, Vinny caught her arm. Mrs. Hartwell, you should know. You're not the first person to ask questions about the fire. There was a young reporter back in the late 80s who got too close to the truth. Grace Winters. What happened to her? Same thing that happens to everyone who crosses the Drake family. She disappeared from the story, lost her job, had to leave town. But she never stopped digging. Word is she's been waiting for someone like you to come along. Someone with enough evidence to make the truth stick. Eleanor smiled grimly. Then it's time to give her what she's been waiting for. As she walked back to her car, Eleanor felt the weight of Vinny's secrets settling on her shoulders, but rather than feeling burdened, she felt energized. For the first time in years, she had a purpose that matched the magnitude of her capabilities. The methodical investigation that had started in her study the night before was becoming something larger, more dangerous, and infinitely more important. The next step would be to contact Judge Harold Pembroke, her old classmate who had his own reasons for wanting to see justice done. But first, she needed to process what Vinny had revealed and develop a strategy that would protect not just him but everyone who would be endangered by the truth they were about to expose. The quiet librarian who had been dismissed at the town meeting was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that the most dangerous secrets were the ones that people had been paid to keep buried. And Eleanor Hartwell was about to dig up every last one of them. Judge Harold Pembroke's private study occupied the entire second floor of his Victorian home on Maple Street, its walls lined with legal volumes that spanned 5 decades of jurisprudence. Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs at 7:30 p.m., her footsteps echoing in the quiet house where Harold had lived alone since his wife's death 3 years earlier. The weight of Vinny's revelations pressed against her chest like a physical burden, but she drew strength from the knowledge that she was no longer carrying these secrets alone. Harold answered her knock with the measured dignity that had made him one of the most respected judges in the county. At 78, he maintained the erect posture and sharp eyes that had intimidated lawyers for decades. But Eleanor could see the subtle signs of weariness that came from carrying too many compromises for too long. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth. "I was wondering when you'd come to see me. I heard about your performance at the town meeting." "Performance?" Eleanor settled into the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where she had sat during their brief encounters over the years. School board meetings, library fundraisers, the occasional social gathering where their paths had crossed without ever truly connecting. Harold poured 2 glasses of bourbon from a crystal decanter, a ritual that spoke of old habits and older friendships. Marcus Drake's dismissal of you was unnecessarily harsh, even for him. Eleanor accepted the glass, studying her old classmate's face. They had graduated from Millbrook High in 1970, part of a class of 87 students who had scattered across the country and the decades. Harold had been the serious one, the student council president who had been destined for law school and a career in public service. Eleanor had been the quiet girl who spent her lunch periods in the library, already showing the passion for knowledge and organization that would define her professional life. Harold, I need to talk to you about something that happened long before last night's meeting. Something that I think you know more about than you've ever admitted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His hand stilled on the bourbon glass. What are you referring to? Eleanor opened her folder and spread the documents across his desk, watching his expression change as he recognized forms and reports that he hadn't seen in decades. The 1987 factory fire. The investigation that was closed too quickly. The environmental violations that were never properly addressed. Harold leaned back in his chair, his face aging 10 years in the span of a moment. Eleanor, that case was resolved according to the law. The investigation was thorough, the insurance claims were processed, and the property was transferred to the town for public use. What more do you want to know? I want to know why you expedited the closure of the investigation. I want to know why environmental reports were sealed. And I want to know why you've been carrying the weight of that decision for 37 years. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner and the distant sound of traffic on Maple Street. Harold's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his bourbon. How did you know? He asked finally. Because I've known you for almost 60 years, Harold. I've watched you build a reputation for integrity and careful deliberation. The Harold Pembroke I knew would never have rushed a case involving 3 deaths unless he was under extraordinary pressure. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where they had both grown up, where they had both built their lives and made their compromises. I was 32 years old. I had 2 young children and a wife, and I'd just been appointed to the bench. I thought I was going to change the world, make the legal system work for everyone. What changed your mind? The Drake family. He turned back to face her, his expression haunted. They didn't threaten me directly. They didn't have to. They just made it clear that my career, my family's future, everything I had worked for could disappear if I didn't understand how things worked in Millbrook. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. What did they want you to do? Expedite the investigation. Seal the environmental reports. Make sure the insurance companies paid out quickly, and the property could be transferred to the town without complications. Harold's voice was barely above a whisper. They said it would be better for everyone if the whole thing just went away quietly. And you agreed? I told myself I was protecting the community. That dragging out the investigation would just cause more pain for the families of the victims. That the environmental issues were minor and could be addressed during the cleanup. He laughed bitterly. I actually believed that I was doing the right thing. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice gentle but insistent. Harold, what really happened during that investigation? What did you see in those reports that made you agree to seal them? Harold returned to his chair, his movements those of an old man carrying a heavy burden. The environmental violations were worse than anyone knew. The factory had been storing chemicals improperly for years. The structural modifications had created a tinderbox that was guaranteed to explode eventually. And the safety violations. God, Eleanor. Those 3 men died because the emergency exits had been blocked by storage containers. But there was something else, wasn't there? Something that made you agree to bury the evidence. Harold's hands shook as he reached for a file cabinet behind his desk. He withdrew a manila envelope, yellowed with age, and placed it on the desk between them. I kept copies. I told myself it was for legal protection, but really, I think I knew that someday I'd need to face what I'd done. Eleanor opened the envelope, her heart racing as she scanned the documents inside. Insurance records, inspection reports, witness statements, all the evidence that had been sealed away from public view. But it was the final document that made her gasp. "This is a geological survey," she said, her voice barely steady. "It shows that the factory site was built over a natural spring that feeds into the town's water supply." "The contamination didn't just affect the factory site," Harold said quietly. "It leached into the groundwater, into the aquifer that supplies half the town." The Drake family knew that if the full extent of the environmental damage became public, they'd be liable for cleanup costs that would have bankrupted them. Eleanor felt the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. "So they paid you to bury the evidence, paid the cleanup crew to hide the contamination, and built the community center on top of it all. And now they want to renovate the community center, which means disturbing the contaminated soil again. Which means more exposure, more risk to public health, more evidence that could surface." Harold's voice carried the weight of 37 years of guilt. "Eleanor, I've been waiting for this day for decades, waiting for someone to come forward with enough evidence to make the truth stick. Will you help me? Will you help me expose what really happened?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents spread across his desk. "You need to understand what you're asking. The Drake family doesn't just have political power, they have financial power, social power, the kind of influence that can destroy lives and careers. They've been using that power to keep people quiet for generations." "I understand the risks," Eleanor said, "but I also understand that 3 people died, and more people will die if we don't act. The question is whether you're willing to make amends for what you did 37 years ago." Harold looked up at her, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a flicker of the idealistic young judge who had once believed he could change the world. "There's something else you need to know," he said, "about the fire itself. The investigation turned up evidence that suggested it wasn't entirely accidental." Eleanor's blood chilled. "What kind of evidence?" "Accelerant residue in areas where it shouldn't have been. Timing devices that were found in the wreckage but never properly analyzed. Witness statements that were taken but never officially filed." Harold's voice dropped to a whisper. "Eleanor, I think those 3 men were murdered." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her, understanding that what she had uncovered was far worse than simple negligence or environmental cover-up. "You're saying the Drake family deliberately caused the fire?" "I'm saying the evidence suggests it was arson. Whether it was meant to kill those 3 men, or whether their deaths were an unintended consequence, I don't know. But the fire was deliberately set, and the investigation was deliberately buried." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where ordinary people lived their lives, unaware of the secrets that had shaped their community for decades. "Harold, if that's true, then we're not just talking about environmental crimes or safety violations. We're talking about murder." Eleanor squared her shoulders. "Then it's time someone stood up to them who's too old to be afraid of losing a career and too angry to be intimidated." As she walked back to her car, Eleanor felt the weight of Harold's secrets joining the burden she already carried. But rather than feeling overwhelmed, she felt energized. The methodical investigation that had started in her study was becoming something larger, more dangerous, and infinitely more important. The next step would be to contact Detective Sarah Martinez, the idealistic young officer who had returned to Millbrook with hopes of making a difference. But first, Eleanor needed to process what Harold had revealed and develop a strategy that would protect not just their witnesses, but everyone who would be endangered by the truth they were about to expose. The quiet librarian who had been dismissed at the town meeting was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that the most dangerous secrets were the ones that people had been paid to keep buried. And Eleanor Hartwell was about to dig up every last one of them, with the help of allies who had been waiting decades for the chance to make things right. Detective Sarah Martinez sat in her unmarked patrol car outside the Millbrook Police Department at 6:45 a.m., watching the sun rise over a town that had seemed so full of promise when she'd returned 3 years ago. The coffee in her travel mug had gone cold while she wrestled with the decision that had kept her awake most of the night. Eleanor Hartwell's phone call had come at 11:30 p.m., requesting a meeting that could, quote, change everything about how we understand this town's history. The urgency in the older woman's voice had cut through Sarah's exhaustion and left her with a gnawing certainty that her carefully constructed life was about to be turned upside down. At 38, Sarah had seen enough of the world to understand that small towns weren't the innocent havens that city dwellers imagined them to be. Her years in the military and her subsequent work with the Phoenix Police Department had taught her that corruption and violence existed everywhere, often hidden behind the most respectable facades. But she had hoped that coming home to Millbrook would be different, that the town where she'd grown up would offer the kind of meaningful police work that had drawn her to law enforcement in the first place. Instead, she'd found a department where certain cases were quietly discouraged, where specific names were never investigated too thoroughly, where the phrase, "that's just how things work here," was used to justify compromises that would have been unthinkable in her previous assignments. She'd told herself that every police department had its politics, that she could work within the system to make incremental changes. But Eleanor's call had awakened something in her that she'd been trying to ignore, the growing certainty that the system itself was the problem. Eleanor arrived at exactly 7 a.m., her punctuality reflecting the institutional habits of someone who had spent decades managing complex schedules and multiple priorities. She carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen 40 years of use, and her expression held the kind of focused determination that Sarah recognized from her own mirror during the hardest cases of her career. "Detective Martinez," Eleanor said, settling into the passenger seat with practiced efficiency. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Sarah studied the older woman's face, noting the signs of sleepless nights and intense concentration. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have to be honest with you. Your call last night, you mentioned evidence of corruption and cover-up. That's a serious accusation, and I need to know what we're dealing with before I can decide how to proceed." Eleanor opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder, her movements suggesting someone who had spent considerable time organizing and preparing her presentation. "Detective, what I'm about to show you connects to several cases that I believe you've been discouraged from investigating too thoroughly." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of cases?" "The Henderson family's water contamination lawsuit that was settled out of court. The cluster of cancer cases in the Riverside neighborhood that was attributed to, quote, unknown environmental factors. The suspicious number of birth defects in children born to families who live near the community center." Eleanor's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the underlying anger. All of these cases have something in common. They're connected to contamination that's been covered up for nearly 40 years. Eleanor spread documents across the dashboard and seat between them, creating a timeline that began with the 1987 factory fire and continued through to the present day. Sarah's training had taught her to evaluate evidence objectively, but what she saw made her hands tremble slightly as she read through insurance reports, medical records, and environmental assessments. "Mrs. Hartwell, where did you get these documents? Some of these are sealed records, others are medical files that should be confidential." "I've been collecting information about this town's history for 45 years. Eleanor replied. "Some of these documents were obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. Others were given to me by people who wanted the truth preserved even if they couldn't speak it themselves. And some were provided by someone who's been carrying the burden of this secret for decades." Sarah continued reading, her professional skepticism warring with growing alarm as the scope of the cover-up became clear. "This geological survey shows contamination of the water supply. These medical records suggest elevated cancer rates in specific neighborhoods. And these insurance documents, they show payments to keep people quiet about environmental damage." "The factory fire in 1987 wasn't just an industrial accident," Eleanor said. "It was the result of criminal negligence, possibly arson, and the subsequent cover-up has been poisoning our community for almost 40 years. Sarah looked up from the documents, her mind racing through the implications. Mrs. Hartwell, if what you're suggesting is true, then we're talking about multiple felonies, environmental crimes, potentially murder. Why haven't you taken this to the FBI or the state attorney general? Eleanor's laugh was bitter. Because half the evidence involves the police department, the town council, and the judicial system. The corruption isn't just about the original crime, it's about the ongoing conspiracy to keep it hidden. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What are you saying about the police department? Eleanor reached into her briefcase and withdrew another folder, this one marked with dates from the past 3 years. Detective, I think you already know the answer to that question. How many times have you been told to close cases without proper investigation? How many times have you been discouraged from pursuing leads that might embarrass certain families? Sarah's hands clenched on the steering wheel. She thought about the Henderson water contamination case, where Chief Morrison had told her to let the lawyers handle it after she'd found evidence of illegal dumping. She remembered the birth defects cluster investigation that had been quietly transferred to the state health department after she'd started mapping the affected addresses. Most recently, there had been the suspicious pattern of respiratory illnesses in the Riverside neighborhood that she'd been ordered to classify as, quote, unrelated incidents. My chief has been very clear about maintaining good relationships with community leaders, Sarah said carefully. But that doesn't necessarily mean, Detective, Chief Morrison has been receiving payments from the Drake family for 15 years, Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of documented fact. Not bribes exactly, but consulting fees, campaign contributions, and family favors that add up to a substantial financial relationship. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her. How do you know that? Because I've been tracking the money trail. Political donations, consulting contracts, business partnerships involving the chief's family members. The Drake family has been very careful to make their influence look legitimate, but the pattern is clear to anyone who knows how to look. Eleanor showed her bank records, campaign finance reports, and business incorporation documents that painted a picture of systematic corruption extending throughout the police department's leadership. Sarah's professional training warred with her personal loyalty to colleagues she'd worked alongside for 3 years. Mrs. Hartwell, what you're showing me, if this is accurate, then every case involving the Drake family or related environmental issues has been compromised. Every investigation has been influenced by financial considerations rather than legal ones. That's exactly what I'm saying, Eleanor replied. And I think you suspected it for a long time. The question is whether you're willing to do something about it. Sarah stared out at the police station where she'd hoped to build a career serving her community. The building looked the same as always, but her understanding of what went on inside had been fundamentally altered. She thought about her father, who had served as a Millbrook patrol officer for 20 years before his death, and wondered if he had known about the corruption, or if he had been kept in the dark like she had been. Detective, I need to ask you something directly, Eleanor said. Have you ever been ordered to suppress evidence or discourage witnesses in cases involving environmental health issues? Sarah closed her eyes, remembering conversations with Chief Morrison that had left her feeling uneasy but unable to articulate exactly why. There have been instances where I've been told that certain investigations weren't worth pursuing, that the community would be better served by focusing on other priorities. What kind of investigations? The water contamination complaints, the pattern of illnesses in neighborhoods near the community center, the suspicious number of cancer cases in families who worked at the old factory site. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. I was told that these were civil matters, not criminal ones, and that pursuing them would just create unnecessary anxiety in the community. Eleanor nodded grimly. And how did you feel about those orders? Like I was being asked to ignore my duty as a police officer. Like I was being asked to protect certain people at the expense of others. Sarah looked at Eleanor directly. Mrs. Hartwell, I became a cop because I wanted to serve justice, but I've been feeling like I'm serving something else entirely. You've been serving a system that was corrupted long before you joined it, Eleanor said. The question is whether you're willing to help me expose that corruption, knowing that it could cost you your career and make you enemies of some very powerful people. Sarah considered the question carefully, thinking about the oath she'd taken when she joined the force, about the ideals that had drawn her to law enforcement, about the kind of community she wanted Millbrook to be. She thought about the families who had been sickened by contamination, about the 3 men who had died in the factory fire, about the ongoing cover-up that was still affecting people's health. "What would you need from me?" she asked finally. "I need you to reopen the investigations that were prematurely closed. I need you to document the evidence that was ignored or suppressed. And I need you to provide protection for the witnesses who are willing to come forward." Sarah felt a surge of both fear and excitement. "Mrs. Hartwell, if I do this, I'll be going against direct orders from my chief. I'll be challenging a system that's been in place for decades. There's no guarantee that we'll succeed, and there's every chance that we'll both pay a heavy price for trying." "Detective, 3 people died in that fire. Dozens of families have been sickened by contamination. An entire community has been lied to for 40 years. The price of trying to expose the truth can't be higher than the price of letting it remain buried." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding that this was the moment that would define not just her career, but her integrity as a person. "What do you need me to do first?" Eleanor smiled for the first time since entering the car. "I need you to officially reopen the factory fire investigation. I have a witness who's willing to testify about the cover-up, and I have evidence that suggests the fire was deliberately set. Arson? Arson resulting in 3 deaths. Which means we're not just talking about environmental crimes or corruption. We're talking about murder." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Mrs. Hartwell, murder cases don't have statute of limitations. If we can prove that the fire was deliberately set, if we can prove that the Drake family was involved, then we can bring justice to 3 men who died nearly 40 years ago, and we can prevent more deaths from the ongoing contamination." Eleanor's voice carried the steel of absolute determination, but we have to be very careful about how we proceed. The people we're investigating have resources, connections, and a long history of silencing those who threaten them. Sarah looked at the documents spread between them, understanding that her life was about to change irrevocably. "I'll need to conduct this investigation quietly, at least initially. I'll need to build a case that's so solid that it can't be dismissed or buried. I can help with that. I have 40 years of institutional knowledge about this town, and I know where the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively." As they prepared to part ways, Sarah felt a mixture of fear and purpose that she hadn't experienced since her early days in law enforcement. "Mrs. Hartwell, you should know that once we start down this path, there's no going back. We're going to be fighting people who have been protecting these secrets for decades." Eleanor gathered her documents, her movements precise and determined. "Detective, I'm 72 years old. I've spent my entire career preserving the truth, and I'm not going to stop now. The question is whether you're ready to join me in making sure that truth finally sees the light of day." Sarah watched Eleanor walk back to her car, marveling at the transformation she'd witnessed. The dismissed old woman from the town meeting had become a formidable investigator, someone who had methodically assembled a case that could bring down the most powerful family in the county. As she drove toward the police station, Sarah felt the weight of the decision she'd just made. For the first time in 3 years, she was going to do her job the way it was supposed to be done. The consequences would be severe, but the alternative, continuing to serve a corrupted system that protected the guilty and abandoned the innocent, was no longer acceptable. The quiet detective, who had been discouraged from asking too many questions, was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that true law enforcement meant pursuing justice regardless of the personal or professional cost. And Sarah Martinez was about to discover just how dangerous that commitment could be in a town where the truth had been buried for 40 years. Eleanor sat in her study at 9:15 a.m., staring at the laptop screen that had become both her greatest asset and her most intimidating challenge. The documents she'd spent decades collecting in physical form were now digitized, organized, and ready for distribution, but she lacked the technical knowledge to reach the audience that mattered most. At 72, she had taught herself to use computers, databases, and basic internet research, but social media and digital organizing remained foreign territory. The business card Detective Martinez had given her the previous morning bore the name Amara Okafor and a phone number with a note scrawled on the back. Community organizer. Tech savvy? Might be able to help with outreach. Sarah had mentioned that Amara was young, passionate, and had moved to Millbrook during the pandemic with ideas about grassroots organizing that the established power structure found threatening. Eleanor's phone call to Amara at 10:30 a.m. had resulted in a cautious agreement to meet at the independent coffee shop on Main Street, neutral ground where they could assess each other without the intimidation factor of age or institutional authority. As Eleanor walked the 3 blocks to the meeting, she observed her town with new eyes, seeing the subtle signs of environmental damage that she'd learned to recognize through her research. The unusually high number of for sale signs in certain neighborhoods, the pattern of respiratory illness that had become normalized, the way certain areas of town were avoided by families with young children. Amara Okafor was nothing like Eleanor had expected. At 29, she possessed the kind of focused energy that comes from believing you can change the world, combined with the technical skills that made such change possible. Her dark skin was set off by a brightly colored head wrap, and her laptop was covered with stickers representing various social justice causes. She had claimed a corner table at the coffee shop, her workspace organized with the efficiency of someone who conducted business from multiple locations. Mrs. Hartwell, Amara said, standing to shake hands with a grip that was firm and direct. Detective Martinez said you have information about environmental crimes that the authorities have been covering up for decades. Eleanor settled into the chair across from her, noting how the younger woman's eyes never stopped moving, constantly assessing the environment and the people around them. I have evidence of systematic corruption dating back to 1987, involving environmental contamination, wrongful deaths, and ongoing cover-up by local officials. The question is whether you're willing to help me get that information to the public. Amara's expression shifted from polite interest to focused attention. What kind of evidence? Eleanor opened her laptop and turned it toward Amara, displaying the timeline she'd created connecting the factory fire to ongoing health problems in the community. She watched the younger woman's eyes widen as the scope of the cover-up became clear. This is huge, Amara said, scrolling through the documents. You're talking about murder, environmental crimes, corruption of public officials. Why hasn't this been exposed before? Because the people with the power to expose it have been paid to keep quiet, and the people who wanted to expose it have been silenced through intimidation or discreditation, Eleanor replied. But I think the digital age has changed the game. Information can be shared faster than it can be suppressed, and grassroots organizing can bypass traditional media outlets. Amara leaned back in her chair, her mind clearly racing through possibilities. You're right that digital organizing has changed everything. But you're also talking about going up against people who have unlimited resources and political connections. They'll fight back, and they'll fight dirty. Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message from Ruby Washington. Heard you were asking questions about the Drake family. Please be careful. Some secrets are too dangerous to expose. It's already started, Eleanor said, showing Amara the message. Word is getting out that I'm investigating the factory fire and people are scared. That tells me we're on the right track. Amara studied the message, her expression growing more serious. Mrs. Hartwell, if we do this, if we really commit to exposing this corruption, we need to be strategic about it. We need to build a campaign that can't be stopped once it starts, something that reaches so many people so quickly that suppression becomes impossible. What would that look like? Amara opened her own laptop and began typing rapidly. We create a multimedia campaign. Document everything. Create video testimonies. Build a website that can't be taken down. Use social media to reach people across generational lines. We make the evidence so accessible and so widely distributed that it becomes impossible to ignore. Eleanor watched in fascination as Amara's fingers flew across the keyboard, creating mock-ups of social media posts, website layouts, and digital pamphlets. The younger woman's technical skills were impressive, but more importantly, She seemed to understand the political implications of what they were attempting. "This is more than just exposing corruption," Amara said, looking up from her screen. "This is about changing the power structure of an entire community. The Drake family has controlled Millbrook for generations, and they're not going to give up that control without a fight." "What kind of fight?" "The kind that involves attacking your credibility, your reputation, your mental health. They'll try to make you look like a confused old woman who's lost touch with reality. They'll spread rumors, create doubts, make people question whether you can be trusted." Eleanor felt a chill, but also a familiar determination. "Then we need to make sure our evidence is so solid that personal attacks become irrelevant." Amara nodded. "Exactly. And we need to build a coalition of supporters who can vouch for your credibility and amplify your message." "Who else knows about this investigation?" Eleanor described her conversations with Vincent Rossini, Judge Pembroke, and Detective Martinez, watching Amara's eyes light up as she understood the scope of the alliance they were building. A whistleblower, a judge, and a detective. That's credible institutional support. But we also need grassroots support, people who have been affected by the contamination and are willing to speak publicly about it. How do we find those people? We start by mapping the areas that have been most affected by the contamination. Then we reach out to families who have experienced health problems that might be related. We create a safe space for people to share their stories, and we document everything. Eleanor felt both excited and overwhelmed by the scope of what Amara was proposing. "This is much more complicated than I initially thought. It has to be," Amara replied. "The Drake family has had decades to perfect their system of control. If we're going to challenge them, we need to be more organized, more strategic, and more persistent than they are." They spent the next 2 hours developing a comprehensive plan. Amara would create a secure website and social media presence, while Eleanor would continue gathering evidence and building their coalition of witnesses. They would coordinate their efforts with Detective Martinez's official investigation, using her police authority to lend credibility to their grassroots campaign. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Eleanor felt a sense of purpose that she hadn't experienced since her library days. "Amara, I want you to know that this could be dangerous. The Drake family has a long history of making troublemakers disappear. Mrs. Hartwell, I've been organizing around environmental justice issues for years. I know how powerful interests protect themselves. But I also know that the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when people are committed to making sure it does." Eleanor walked home with a new understanding of how the fight would unfold. The methodical investigation that had started in her study was becoming a comprehensive campaign that would challenge not just the Drake family, but the entire power structure that had enabled their corruption. That evening, as she digitized more documents and prepared materials for Amara's website, Eleanor received a phone call that made her blood run cold. The voice was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. "Some secrets are better left buried, Mrs. Hartwell. For everyone's sake." The line went dead before she could respond, but the implication was unmistakable. Marcus Drake had learned about her investigation, and he was prepared to fight back. The quiet librarian who had been dismissed at the town meeting was now seen as a threat significant enough to warrant intimidation. Eleanor looked at her reflection in the dark window of her study, seeing not the invisible old woman she had been, but the formidable opponent she had become. The digital revolution that would expose 40 years of corruption had begun, and there was no turning back. The next morning would bring new challenges, new threats, and new opportunities to expose the truth. But for the first time in years, Eleanor felt truly alive, truly purposeful, and truly dangerous to those who had counted on her silence. Grace Winters stood in the doorway of the Millbrook Daily Herald at 6:30 a.m., her press credentials hanging from a lanyard that had seen better days, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder with the weight of a decision that would define the rest of her career. The newspaper office hadn't changed much since her abrupt departure in 1988. The same cramped workspace, the same smell of coffee and newsprint, The same feeling that important stories were being buried beneath the mundane reporting of city council meetings and high school sports. Editor-in-Chief Mark Sullivan looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation but dreading it nonetheless. At 52, he had spent his entire career at the Herald, working his way up from cub reporter to managing editor, to his current position overseeing a newspaper that had become little more than a community bulletin board. His hair had gone gray during the years when investigative journalism had been quietly discouraged, when certain stories had been killed before they could see print. "Grace," he said, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had made too many compromises. "I heard you were back in town, asking questions about the old factory fire." Grace set her laptop bag on the chair across from his desk but remained standing, her posture reflecting the tension of someone who had spent 17 years preparing for this moment. "Mark, I need to talk to you about running a story. A big story. The kind that could change everything about how people understand this town." Mark's expression grew cautious. "What kind of story?" Grace opened her laptop and began displaying the evidence that Eleanor had shared with her. Documents, photographs, witness statements, and environmental reports that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning 4 decades. The 1987 factory fire was arson. The environmental contamination was covered up. 3 men were murdered, and the people responsible have been running this town ever since. Mark leaned back in his chair, his face aging 10 years in the span of a moment. "Grace, we've been through this before. The factory fire was investigated, the case was closed, and the town moved on. Why are you trying to resurrect something that was settled decades ago?" "Because it was never settled," Grace replied, her voice carrying the intensity of someone who had spent years waiting for this opportunity. "It was buried, and now I have evidence that proves it." She showed him the timeline that Eleanor had constructed, the witness statements that Vincent Rossini had provided, the environmental reports that Judge Pembroke had unsealed. Mark's expression grew more troubled as the scope of the cover-up became clear. "Grace, even if everything you're showing me is true, even if we could prove that the Drake family was involved in covering up environmental crimes, do you understand what would happen to this newspaper if we published this story?" Grace sat down, her movement deliberate and controlled. "Mark, I understand that you're afraid. I understand that the Drake family has influence, that they have ways of making life difficult for people who cross them. But I also understand that 3 people died, and dozens of families have been sickened by contamination, and an entire community has been lied to for 40 years. Mark stood and walked to the window that looked out over Main Street, where the morning rush hour was beginning in earnest. "You know what happened the last time you tried to investigate the Drake family. You lost your job, your reputation, everything you had worked for. What makes you think this time will be different?" "Because this time I have evidence they can't suppress, witnesses they can't silence, and documentation they can't make disappear." Grace's voice carried the steel of absolute determination. "And because this time I'm not a young reporter who can be intimidated. I'm a veteran journalist who has spent 17 years preparing for this moment." Mark turned back to face her, his expression reflecting the internal struggle of someone who had spent years compromising his principles. "Grace, if we publish this story, the Drake family will destroy us. They'll pull advertising, pressure our distributors, make it impossible for us to operate. They'll file libel suits, challenge our licenses, do everything they can to put us out of business. And if we don't publish it, how many more people will die from the contamination? How many more families will be sickened? How much longer will this community be poisoned by lies?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of the morning news team arriving for work. Grace could see the conflict in Mark's eyes, the struggle between professional ambition and journalistic integrity. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked finally. Grace opened her laptop and displayed the article she had been working on for the past week, a comprehensive investigation that connected the factory fire to ongoing environmental crimes, supported by documentation that spanned 4 decades. "I'm proposing that we publish the most important story in this newspaper's history. A story that will finally give this community the truth it deserves. Mark read through the article, his expression growing more amazed and more troubled with each paragraph. Grace, this is extraordinary journalism. This is the kind of investigative reporting that wins awards, that changes communities, that makes careers. It's also the kind of reporting that destroys careers, Grace replied. The question is whether you're willing to risk everything to make sure the truth finally sees the light of day. Mark was quiet for a long moment, staring at the article on Grace's screen. Who else knows about this investigation? Eleanor Hartwell, the retired librarian who started the investigation. Detective Sarah Martinez, who's reopening the official police investigation. Judge Harold Pembroke, who's providing legal support. Vincent Rossini, who's willing to testify about the cover-up. And Amara Okafor, who's helping with digital organizing and community outreach. Mark's eyes widened. You're talking about a conspiracy that involves half the town's leadership. If you're right, if the Drake family really has been covering up environmental crimes for decades, then this story won't just expose corruption, it will trigger a complete transformation of how this community is governed. That's exactly what I'm talking about, Grace said. And that's exactly why it needs to be published. Mark stood and walked to his filing cabinet, withdrawing a folder that had been locked away for 17 years. Grace, there's something you need to see. Something I should have shown you a long time ago. He opened the folder and showed her documents that made her gasp, the original drafts of the articles she had written about the factory fire in 1987, complete with editor's notes and publisher's comments. The notes revealed that the articles had been killed not because of insufficient evidence, but because of direct pressure from the Drake family. They threatened to bankrupt the newspaper if we published your investigation, Mark said quietly. They had advertisers lined up to pull their support, they had legal challenges prepared, they had political pressure ready to be applied. The publisher made the decision that protecting the newspaper was more important than exposing the truth. Grace felt 17 years of frustration and anger crystallize into pure determination. Mark, they silenced me once. They destroyed my career, my reputation, my life. But they can't do it again. This time I have too much evidence, too many witnesses, too much support. What makes you so sure? Because this time I'm not alone. This time I have Eleanor Hartwell, who has spent 40 years documenting this town's history. I have Detective Martinez, who's conducting an official investigation. I have Judge Pembroke, who's providing legal protection. And I have Amara Okafor, who understands how to use digital media to make sure the story reaches people they can't control. Mark looked at the documents spread across his desk, understanding that he was facing the most important decision of his editorial career. Grace, if we publish this story, everything changes. Not just for the Drake family, but for everyone in this town. There will be investigations, prosecutions, lawsuits. Lives will be destroyed. Lives are already being destroyed, Grace replied. The question is whether we're going to continue enabling that destruction, or whether we're going to finally stand up for the truth. Mark was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the town that had shaped both of their careers. How long do you need to finish the article? Grace felt a surge of excitement and terror. It's already finished. I've been working on it for a week, cross-referencing every fact, double-checking every source, making sure every detail is bulletproof. Then we publish it in tomorrow's edition. Front page, above the fold, with a full editorial explaining why we're exposing this story now. Grace stood and extended her hand. Mark, you need to understand that once we publish this, there's no going back. The Drake family will come after us with everything they have. Mark shook her hand, his grip firm and resolute. Grace, I've been editor of this newspaper for 15 years. I've spent those years publishing safe stories, avoiding controversy, protecting the status quo. Maybe it's time I remembered why I became a journalist in the first place. As Grace prepared to leave the office, she felt the weight of 17 years of preparation settling on her shoulders. The article that had been killed in 1987 was finally going to see print, supported by evidence that couldn't be suppressed and witnesses who couldn't be silenced. The next morning, the Millbrook Daily Herald would publish the most important story in its history. The quiet cover-up that had protected the Drake family for decades was about to be exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. Grace Winters, the reporter who had been silenced in 1987, was about to discover that the truth, once unleashed, was impossible to contain. The journalist's redemption had begun, and with it, the transformation of an entire community. Tommy Drake stood in his father's study at 11:47 p.m., his hand trembling as he held the manila folder that contained copies of documents he had never been meant to see. The room around him spoke of 3 generations of political power, framed photographs with governors and senators, awards from civic organizations, leather-bound books that had been selected more for their appearance than their contents. But tonight, the familiar symbols of his family's influence felt like evidence of a conspiracy that had shaped his entire life. The folder had been hidden in a locked file cabinet behind his father's desk, discovered during what had started as a routine search for campaign materials. Tommy's responsibility for organizing his father's re-election campaign had given him access to the family's private documents, and what he had found there had shattered his understanding of who his father was and what their family legacy really meant. Insurance records from 1987 showed payments to silence families affected by the factory fire. Environmental reports detailed contamination that had been deliberately concealed. Medical records documented health problems that had been attributed to other causes. And bank statements revealed decades of payments to police officials, judges, and journalists who had agreed to keep the truth buried. Tommy's phone buzzed with a text from his girlfriend, Jessica. "Still working late? You've been so stressed lately, everything okay?" He stared at the message, realizing that he couldn't answer honestly. How could he explain that he had discovered his family was built on a foundation of murder, environmental crimes, and systematic corruption? How could he tell her that the idealistic young man she had fallen in love with was the son of someone who had spent decades poisoning their community? The sound of his father's footsteps in the hallway made Tommy's blood run cold. He quickly returned the documents to the file cabinet and locked it, but not before photographing several key pages with his phone. The evidence was now preserved, but so was his complicity in the cover-up. Marcus Drake entered the study with the confident stride of someone who had never doubted his right to occupy positions of power. At 45, he possessed the kind of charisma that made people want to follow him, combined with the ruthless intelligence that had allowed him to maintain his family's influence for 2 decades. But tonight, Tommy saw something different in his father's expression, a hardness that spoke of someone who would do anything to protect his secrets. "Working late again?" Marcus asked, settling into the leather chair behind his desk. "The campaign is important, but you need to remember to take care of yourself." Quote, "I've been reviewing some of the old family documents for the campaign biography. I found some things that don't quite match up with the official history." Marcus's expression didn't change, but Tommy caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "What kind of things?" "The factory fire in 1987. The official reports say it was an industrial accident, but I found insurance documents that suggest there were safety violations that were never properly investigated." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his movements controlled and deliberate. "Tommy, that was a long time ago. Different era, different standards. What matters is how we've used that tragedy to build a stronger, safer community." "But Dad, the documents I found suggest that Grandpa knew about the safety violations before the fire. That he could have prevented those deaths but chose not to act." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threats. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the town that his family had controlled for 3 generations. "Tommy, there are things about our family's history that you don't understand. Complicated things that require difficult decisions." "What kind of decisions?" Marcus turned back to face his son, his expression carrying the weight of decades of compromise. "The kind that protect our family and our community from forces that would destroy everything we've built." The kind that ensures stability, prosperity, and progress for everyone in Millbrook. Tommy felt his stomach turn. Dad, are you saying that Grandpa deliberately allowed those men to die? I'm saying that your grandfather was a practical man who understood that sometimes individual tragedies serve the greater good. That factory was a safety hazard that would have killed people eventually. The fire simply accelerated the inevitable. The casual dismissal of 3 human lives made Tommy's hands shake with rage. Those men had families, Dad. They had children, wives, people who loved them. How can you talk about their deaths like they were acceptable casualties? Marcus's voice hardened. Because that's how the real world works, Tommy. People die in industrial accidents. Communities deal with environmental challenges, and leaders make tough decisions to protect the greater good. Your grandfather understood that, and someday you'll understand it too. Tommy thought about the environmental reports he had read, the medical records documenting decades of health problems, the bank statements showing payments to keep people quiet. Dad, what about the contamination? What about the families who have been getting sick for 40 years? What about them? Marcus's voice carried a dangerous edge. They've been compensated for their losses, their medical bills have been covered, and their families have been taken care of. We've handled our responsibilities. Handled your responsibilities? Dad, you've been poisoning people for decades. You've been covering up evidence, bribing officials, and silencing anyone who tried to expose the truth. Marcus moved closer to his son, his presence suddenly intimidating. Tommy, I think you need to be very careful about the accusations you're making. There are things about our family's business that you don't understand, and there are consequences for people who threaten our stability. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. The documents you've been looking at are confidential family materials. The information they contain is privileged, and sharing it with anyone would be a betrayal of everything this family stands for. Tommy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Dad, I'm your son. I'm not your enemy. Then act like it, Marcus replied coldly. Stop asking questions about things that don't concern you, and focus on the campaign. We have an election to win, and I need to know that you're completely committed to our success. Tommy stared at his father, seeing him clearly for the first time. The man who had taught him about public service, who had spoken eloquently about community leadership, who had been his role model for ethical behavior, was a murderer who had spent decades covering up his crimes. I need some air, Tommy said, his voice barely steady. Tommy. Marcus's voice carried a warning. Remember what I said about family loyalty. Remember that everything you have, everything you are, comes from this family's success. Don't do anything that would jeopardize that success. Tommy walked out of the study, down the hallway, and into the cool night air, his mind racing with the implications of what he had learned. His phone buzzed with another text from Jessica. Are you okay? You haven't been yourself lately. He stared at the message, realizing that he would never be himself again. The naive idealist who had believed in his family's version of public service was gone, replaced by someone who understood that he had been raised to perpetuate a system of corruption and murder. As he walked through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Tommy thought about the choices that lay ahead of him. He could remain silent, protect his family's secrets, and continue living a lie. Or he could find the courage to expose the truth, knowing that it would destroy everything he had ever believed about his identity and his future. His phone rang at 12:30 a.m. Eleanor Hartwell's voice was calm but urgent. Tommy, I know this is difficult, but I need to talk to you. I have evidence about your family's involvement in the factory fire, and I think you might be ready to hear the truth. Tommy closed his eyes, understanding that this was the moment that would define the rest of his life. He could hang up the phone, return to his father's house, and pretend that none of this had happened. Or he could find the courage to face the truth about his family and himself. Mrs. Hartwell, he said quietly, I think I'm ready to listen. The son's choice had been made. The third generation of Drake family power was about to be challenged by the one person who had the most to lose and the most to gain from exposing the truth. Tommy Drake, the idealistic young man who had believed in his family's version of public service, was about to discover what it really meant to serve the public good. The Millbrook Community Center had never hosted a public hearing quite like this one. By 7 a.m. on the morning of October 15, 2024, a line of residents stretched around the building, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, anger, and apprehension. The emergency session had been called after Grace Winter's exposé had dominated the front page of the Herald for 3 consecutive days, each article revealing new layers of corruption that had shaped their town for decades. Eleanor Hartwell arrived at 7:30 a.m., her arms full of bankers' boxes containing 4 decades of meticulously organized evidence. She had spent the previous night arranging documents in chronological order, cross-referencing witness statements with official reports, and preparing for what she knew would be the most important presentation of her life. The invisible old woman who had been dismissed at this same podium 6 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the truth, once unleashed, was impossible to contain. Detective Sarah Martinez stood near the entrance, her uniform crisp, and her expression professional, but her eyes reflecting the weight of what she was about to reveal. The internal investigation she had conducted over the past month had uncovered evidence of corruption that extended far beyond the factory fire, implicating police officials, city council members, and business leaders in a conspiracy that had lasted for generations. Judge Harold Pembroke sat in the front row, his formal robes replaced by civilian clothes, but his presence carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades interpreting the law. The legal brief he had prepared outlined the criminal charges that could be filed, the civil remedies that were available, and the constitutional violations that had been committed in the name of protecting the Drake family's interests. Marcus Drake entered the room at 7:45 a.m., flanked by 3 expensive lawyers and carrying himself with the arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His tailored suit and confident smile were designed to project strength, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders, the strain around his eyes that spoke of a man who understood that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. The hearing was called to order by State Attorney General Patricia Chen, who had driven up from the Capitol after Grace's articles had triggered a formal investigation. Her presence signaled that this was no longer a local matter, but a state-level criminal investigation that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. "Ladies and gentlemen," Attorney General Chen began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had prosecuted corruption cases throughout her career. "We are here today to examine allegations of criminal conspiracy, environmental crimes, and systematic corruption that have affected this community for nearly 40 years. The evidence that has been presented suggests that multiple laws have been violated, that public officials have been compromised, and that citizens have been endangered by deliberate concealment of environmental hazards." Eleanor was called as the first witness, her testimony laying out the timeline of corruption that connected the 1987 factory fire to the ongoing community center renovation project. She spoke calmly and methodically, referencing documents that had been sealed for decades, describing patterns of influence that had shaped local politics, and explaining how her institutional knowledge had allowed her to connect seemingly unrelated events. "The factory fire was not an accident," Eleanor stated, her voice carrying across the packed room. "It was the result of criminal negligence that bordered on deliberate homicide. The safety violations had been documented for months, the environmental hazards had been reported to authorities, and the structural deficiencies had been known to the owners and the regulatory officials who were supposed to protect the workers." She displayed photographs from the fire scene, environmental reports that had been suppressed, and witness statements that had never been officially recorded. The audience listened in stunned silence as the scope of the cover-up became clear. Vincent Rossini was called next, his testimony providing the first-hand account of the cleanup operation that had buried evidence and contaminated soil throughout the town. His voice shook as he described the payments he had received to stay quiet, the threats that had been made against his family, and the guilt that had consumed him for 37 years. "We knew we were burying evidence," Vinny said, his weathered hands gripping the microphone. "We knew we were hiding contamination that could hurt people. But we were told it was for the greater good, that keeping the truth buried would protect the community from panic and economic disaster." Detective Martinez presented her investigation into the police department's handling of related cases, revealing how evidence had been suppressed, witnesses had been discouraged, and investigations had been deliberately sabotaged to protect the Drake family's interests. Her testimony was devastating in its clinical precision, outlining decades of corruption that had perverted the justice system. Judge Pembroke testified about the legal pressure he had faced as a young attorney, the compromises he had made to protect his career, and the evidence that had been sealed to prevent public scrutiny. His testimony provided the legal framework for understanding how the conspiracy had operated within the judicial system. Grace Winters presented her investigation into the pattern of environmental illness that had affected the community, connecting decades of health problems to the contamination that had been concealed since the factory fire. Her testimony was supported by medical records, environmental assessments, and epidemiological studies that painted a picture of systematic poisoning. As the day progressed, additional witnesses came forward. Families who had been sickened by contamination, former city employees who had been pressured to ignore safety violations, business owners who had been threatened for asking questions. Each testimony added another layer to the picture of corruption that had shaped Millbrook for generations. Marcus Drake's testimony was scheduled for 4 p.m., but at 3:45 p.m., his attorneys announced that their client would invoke his Fifth Amendment rights and refuse to testify. The announcement triggered a murmur of anger from the audience, but Attorney General Chen had expected this response. "Mr. Drake's refusal to testify is his constitutional right," she announced. "However, the evidence presented today provides sufficient grounds for criminal charges to be filed. The grand jury will be convened next week and formal indictments are expected to follow." The final witness was Tommy Drake, who had requested to testify despite his attorney's objections. His testimony was the most emotionally charged of the day, as he described discovering his family's crimes, confronting his father about the cover-up, and making the decision to cooperate with the investigation. "I was raised to believe that public service meant protecting the community," Tommy said, his voice breaking slightly. "I was taught that leadership required making difficult decisions for the greater good. What I discovered was that my family's version of public service meant protecting ourselves at the expense of everyone else." His testimony included documents he had photographed from his father's files, recordings of conversations with his father about the family's crimes, and a detailed account of how the corruption had been passed down through 3 generations of Drake family leadership. As the hearing concluded at 6:30 p.m., Attorney General Chen announced that criminal charges would be filed against Marcus Drake, several police officials, and multiple city council members. Civil lawsuits would be filed on behalf of the families affected by the contamination, and a federal investigation would examine the environmental crimes that had been covered up. Eleanor sat in the front row as the room emptied, surrounded by the evidence she had spent decades collecting and the allies she had recruited to help expose the truth. The methodical investigation that had started in her study 7 weeks earlier had culminated in a public reckoning that would transform their community forever. Ruby Washington approached her chair, her expression reflecting a mixture of pride and concern. "Eleanor, you did it. You actually did it. But what happens now?" Eleanor looked around the room where she had been silenced 7 weeks earlier, where she had been dismissed as an irrelevant old woman whose voice didn't matter. "Now we do the hard work of rebuilding. We clean up the contamination, we heal the families who were hurt, and we create a system of government that serves the people instead of protecting the powerful." As she packed up her documents, Eleanor felt the weight of the victory settling on her shoulders. The quiet librarian who had been told to stay silent had become the catalyst for the most significant political transformation in Millbrook's history. The reckoning had begun, and there was no going back to the way things had been. The truth, once unleashed, was impossible to contain, and Eleanor Hartwell had made sure that it would never be buried again. The Reckoning, the Millbrook Community Center, had never hosted a public hearing quite like this one. By 7 a.m. on the morning of October 15, 2024, a line of residents stretched around the building, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, anger, and apprehension. The emergency session had been called after Grace Winter's exposé had dominated the front page of the Herald for 3 consecutive days, each article revealing new layers of corruption that had shaped their town for decades. Eleanor Hartwell arrived at 7:30 a.m., her arms full of bankers' boxes containing 4 decades of meticulously organized evidence. She had spent the previous night arranging documents in chronological order, cross-referencing witness statements with official reports, and preparing for what she knew would be the most important presentation of her life. The invisible old woman who had been dismissed at the same podium 6 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the truth, once unleashed, was impossible to contain. Detective Sarah Martinez stood near the entrance, her uniform crisp and her expression professional, but her eyes reflecting the weight of what she was about to reveal. The internal investigation she had conducted over the past month had uncovered evidence of corruption that extended far beyond the factory fire, implicating police officials, city council members, and business leaders in a conspiracy that had lasted for generations. Judge Harold Pembroke sat in the front row, his formal robes replaced by civilian clothes, but his presence carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades interpreting the law. The legal brief he had prepared outlined the criminal charges that could be filed, the civil remedies that were available, and the constitutional violations that had been committed in the name of protecting the Drake family's interests. Marcus Drake entered the room at 7:45 a.m., flanked by 3 expensive lawyers, and carrying himself with the arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His tailored suit and confident smile were designed to project strength, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders, the strain around his eyes that spoke of a man who understood that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. The hearing was called to order by State Attorney General Patricia Chen, who had driven up from the Capitol after Grace's articles had triggered a formal investigation. Her presence signaled that this was no longer a local matter, but a state-level criminal investigation that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. "Ladies and gentlemen," Attorney General Chen began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had prosecuted corruption cases throughout her career, "we are here today to examine allegations of criminal conspiracy, environmental crimes, and systematic corruption that have affected this community for nearly 40 years. The evidence that has been presented suggests that multiple laws have been violated, that public officials have been compromised, and that citizens have been endangered by deliberate concealment of environmental hazards." Eleanor was called as the first witness, her testimony laying out the timeline of corruption that connected the 1987 factory fire to the ongoing community center renovation project. She spoke calmly and methodically, referencing documents that had been sealed for decades, describing patterns of influence that had shaped local politics, and explaining how her institutional knowledge had allowed her to connect seemingly unrelated events. "The factory fire was not an accident," Eleanor stated, her voice carrying across the packed room. "It was the result of criminal negligence that bordered on deliberate homicide. The safety violations had been documented for months, the environmental hazards had been reported to authorities, and the structural deficiencies had been known to the owners and the regulatory officials who were supposed to protect the workers." She displayed photographs from the fire scene, environmental reports that had been suppressed, and witness statements that had never been officially recorded. The audience listened in stunned silence as the scope of the cover-up became clear. Vincent Rossini was called next, his testimony providing the first-hand account of the cleanup operation that had buried evidence and contaminated soil throughout the town. His voice shook as he described the payments he had received to stay quiet, the threats that had been made against his family, and the guilt that had consumed him for 37 years. "We knew we were bearing evidence," Vinny said, his weathered hands gripping the microphone. We knew we were hiding contamination that could hurt people, but we were told it was for the greater good, that keeping the truth buried would protect the community from panic and economic disaster. Detective Martinez presented her investigation into the police department's handling of related cases, revealing how evidence had been suppressed, witnesses had been discouraged, and investigations had been deliberately sabotaged to protect the Drake family's interests. Her testimony was devastating in its clinical precision, outlining decades of corruption that had perverted the justice system. Judge Pembroke testified about the legal pressure he had faced as a young attorney, the compromises he had made to protect his career, and the evidence that had been sealed to prevent public scrutiny. His testimony provided the legal framework for understanding how the conspiracy had operated within the judicial system. Grace Winters presented her investigation into the pattern of environmental illness that had affected the community, connecting decades of health problems to the contamination that had been concealed since the factory fire. Her testimony was supported by medical records, environmental assessments, and epidemiological studies that painted a picture of systematic poisoning. As the day progressed, additional witnesses came forward: families who had been sickened by contamination, former city employees who had been pressured to ignore safety violations, business owners who had been threatened for asking questions. Each testimony added another layer to the picture of corruption that had shaped Millbrook for generations. Marcus Drake's testimony was scheduled for 4 p.m., but at 3:45 p.m., his attorneys announced that their client would invoke his Fifth Amendment rights and refuse to testify. The announcement triggered a murmur of anger from the audience, but Attorney General Chen had expected this response. "Mr. Drake's refusal to testify is his constitutional right," she announced. However, the evidence presented today provides sufficient grounds for criminal charges to be filed. The grand jury will be convened next week, and formal indictments are expected to follow. The final witness was Tommy Drake, who had requested to testify despite his attorney's objections. His testimony was the most emotionally charged of the day, as he described discovering his family's crimes, confronting his father about the cover-up, and making the decision to cooperate with the investigation. "I was raised to believe that public service meant protecting the community," Tommy said, his voice breaking slightly. "I was taught that leadership required making difficult decisions for the greater good. What I discovered was that my family's version of public service meant protecting ourselves at the expense of everyone else." His testimony included documents he had photographed from his father's files, recordings of conversations with his father about the family's crimes, and a detailed account of how the corruption had been passed down through 3 generations of Drake family leadership. As the hearing concluded at 6:30 p.m., Attorney General Chen announced that criminal charges would be filed against Marcus Drake, several police officials, and multiple city council members. Civil lawsuits would be filed on behalf of the families affected by the contamination, and a federal investigation would examine the environmental crimes that had been covered up. Eleanor sat in the front row as the room emptied, surrounded by the evidence she had spent decades collecting and the allies she had recruited to help expose the truth. The methodical investigation that had started in her study 7 weeks earlier had culminated in a public reckoning that would transform their community forever. Ruby Washington approached her chair, her expression reflecting a mixture of pride and concern. "Eleanor, you did it. You actually did it. But what happens now?" Eleanor looked around the room where she had been silenced 7 weeks earlier, where she had been dismissed as an irrelevant old woman whose voice didn't matter. "Now we do the hard work of rebuilding. We clean up the contamination, we heal the families who were hurt, and we create a system of government that serves the people instead of protecting the powerful." As she packed up her documents, Eleanor felt the weight of the victory settling on her shoulders. The quiet librarian who had been told to stay silent had become the catalyst for the most significant political transformation in Millbrook's history. The reckoning had begun, and there was no going back to the way things had been. The truth, once unleashed, was impossible to contain. And Eleanor Hartwell had made sure that it would never be buried again. Part 10. The Quiet Revolution. 6 months after the hearings that had transformed Millbrook forever, Eleanor Hartwell stood in the early morning sunlight at the site where the old factory had once stood. The contaminated soil had been excavated and properly disposed of, the groundwater had been treated, and the area had been converted into a memorial park that honored both the victims of the original fire and the courage of those who had finally exposed the truth. The bronze plaque at the center of the memorial bore the names of the 3 workers who had died in 1987, Michael Chen, Roberto Vasquez, and David Washington. Below their names, an inscription read, "Their deaths were not in vain. Their memory inspired a community to demand justice and truth." Eleanor placed 3 white roses at the base of the memorial, a ritual she had maintained every week since the park's dedication. Macy laid her. At 73, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to value each day, but her eyes held the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished something that mattered. Tommy Drake approached from across the park, his footsteps quiet on the newly laid stone pathway. At 23, he had aged considerably in the past 6 months, the weight of his testimony and its consequences etched in the lines around his eyes. But there was also a sense of purpose in his bearing, the confidence that came from making difficult choices and accepting their consequences. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying the respect that had developed between them during the long process of investigation and prosecution. "I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done, for the courage you showed in exposing the truth, and for the kindness you've shown me during this process." Eleanor studied the young man who had chosen to testify against his own father, who had sacrificed his family's wealth and influence to serve the cause of justice. "Tommy, you're the one who deserves thanks. It took extraordinary courage to stand up to your father, to choose the truth over family loyalty." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise over a town that had been fundamentally changed by the events of the past 6 months. Marcus Drake was serving a 15-year sentence for environmental crimes, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. The police chief and 3 city council members had been convicted of corruption charges. The civil lawsuits had resulted in a $50 million settlement fund that was being used to provide medical care for families affected by the contamination. "How are you adjusting to your new role?" Eleanor asked, referencing Tommy's recent appointment to the Community Oversight Board that had been established to prevent future corruption. Tommy's smile was rueful. "It's harder than I expected. Everyone watches me carefully, wondering if I'm going to turn out like my father. Some people will never trust me because of my name, and others expect me to somehow make up for 3 generations of corruption. That's a heavy burden to carry." "It is, but it's also an opportunity. I can spend my life trying to make amends for what my family did, or I can focus on building something better. I've chosen to focus on the future." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "That's the right choice. The past can't be changed, but the future can be shaped by the decisions we make today." They walked together toward the community center, which had been renovated using funds from the settlement and now served as a model for transparent, community-controlled development. The building incorporated environmental monitoring systems, public meeting spaces, and a historical archive that ensured the events of 1987 would never be forgotten. Detective Sarah Martinez was waiting for them in the parking lot, her uniform replaced by civilian clothes, but her presence still carrying the authority of someone who had helped expose one of the most significant corruption cases in state history. Her promotion to police chief had been unanimous, and her reforms had transformed the department into a model for community policing. "Eleanor, Tommy," she said, her voice carrying the warmth that had developed between them during the investigation. "I have some news about the federal investigation. The EPA has officially cleared the groundwater, and the state health department has confirmed that the contamination has been successfully remediated." Eleanor felt a surge of satisfaction. "What about the families who were affected? Are they getting the medical care they need?" "The settlement fund is covering all medical expenses, and we've established a long-term monitoring program to track any ongoing health effects. It's not perfect, but it's the best we can do given the circumstances." They entered the community center together, where the weekly oversight board meeting was about to begin. The room was packed with residents who had never shown interest in local government before the scandal, but who now understood that civic engagement was essential for preventing future corruption. Judge Harold Pembroke was serving as the board's legal advisor, his decades of experience providing guidance for the new systems of accountability that had been established. His presence had helped legitimize the oversight process and ensure that legal procedures were followed correctly. Amara Okafor had been elected to the city council in a special election, her grassroots organizing experience and technical skills making her an effective advocate for transparency and community engagement. Her digital platform had become a model for civic participation, allowing residents to monitor government activities and participate in decision-making processes. Grace Winters was covering the meeting for the Herald, which had been purchased by a nonprofit foundation dedicated to investigative journalism. Her series on the Drake family corruption had won a Pulitzer Prize, but more importantly, it had inspired a new generation of journalists to pursue accountability reporting. Vincent Rossini sat in the front row, his testimony having earned him both legal immunity and community respect. The guilt that had consumed him for 37 years had been replaced by a sense of redemption, and his grandchildren were proud to bear his name. Dr. Patricia Levine had established a community health clinic that provided free medical care to families affected by the contamination. Her willingness to speak out about the health effects of the cover-up had helped establish the medical evidence needed for the civil lawsuits. As the meeting began, Eleanor looked around the room at the faces of people who had found their voices through the process of exposing corruption. The invisible old woman, who had been dismissed at a town meeting 7 months earlier, had become the catalyst for a transformation that extended far beyond Millbrook. The Oversight Board meeting focused on the implementation of new environmental monitoring systems, the establishment of a community land trust, and the development of an economic development plan that prioritized public health and environmental protection. The decisions were made through a transparent process that invited public input and required detailed documentation. After the meeting, Eleanor walked home through streets that looked the same but felt fundamentally different. The power structure that had controlled Millbrook for generations had been dismantled, replaced by systems of accountability that ensured the community's voice would be heard. Ruby Washington was waiting on Eleanor's front porch, her expression reflecting the pride and affection that had deepened their friendship through the challenges of the past months. "How was the meeting?" "Productive," Eleanor replied, settling into the porch swing where she and Robert had spent so many evenings. "The new systems are working, the community is engaged, and the future looks brighter than it has in decades." Ruby joined her on the swing, and they watched the sun set over their transformed town. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something. Do you ever regret starting this investigation? Do you ever wish you had just stayed quiet like Marcus told you to?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I regret the pain that the truth caused for innocent people. I regret that it took so long to expose the corruption. But I don't regret speaking out. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and I refuse to be complicit in the suffering of my community." As night fell over Millbrook, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The methodical investigation that had started in her study had become a community-wide movement that had transformed not just their town, but their understanding of what citizenship required. The quiet revolution had succeeded not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through the patient accumulation of evidence, the careful building of alliances, and the unwavering commitment to truth. Eleanor Hartwell, the retired librarian who had been told that old people should stay quiet, had proven that sometimes the most powerful voices belong to those who have been overlooked and underestimated. The work of building a just community would continue for generations, but the foundation had been laid by ordinary people who had found the courage to speak truth to power. The quiet revolution had begun in silence, but it would echo through the years in the voices of citizens who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Eleanor Hartwell's transformation was complete, but her legacy was just beginning. The truth, once unleashed, would continue to inspire others to stand up, speak out, and demand better from their leaders and their communities. The quiet revolution had become a permanent part of Millbrook's DNA, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. One year after the Memorial Park dedication, Eleanor Hartwell sat in her study at 6:30 a.m., the same room where her investigation had begun 18 months earlier. The banker's boxes that had once contained decades of hidden secrets now held correspondence from communities across the country. Letters from citizens who had read about Millbrook's transformation and wanted guidance for their own battles against corruption. The morning light filtered through windows that looked out over a town that bore little resemblance to the one where she had been silenced at a community meeting. The changes were both visible and invisible. New environmental monitoring stations dotted the landscape, but more importantly, the culture of secrecy and intimidation that had defined Millbrook for generations had been replaced by transparency and civic engagement. Eleanor's laptop displayed an email from a retired teacher in Oregon whose small town was facing similar environmental cover-ups. The message was one of dozens she received weekly from people who had heard about the Millbrook method, the systematic approach to exposing corruption that combined institutional memory, careful documentation, and strategic alliance building. Mrs. Hartwell, the email read, "I'm 68 years old, and I've been watching our town council cover up contamination from an old mining operation for 20 years. After reading about your investigation, I think I finally understand how to fight back. Can you help me organize my evidence the way you did?" Eleanor smiled as she typed her response, offering to share the database system she had developed and to connect the teacher with other activists who were fighting similar battles. The network that had grown from her solitary investigation now included hundreds of citizens across the country who were using similar methods to expose corruption in their own communities. The sound of footsteps on her front porch interrupted her work. Tommy Drake stood at her door, carrying a cardboard box and wearing the expression of someone who had important news to share. His weekly visits had become a ritual they both treasured, a way of processing the ongoing transformation of their community and planning for the challenges ahead. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I have something I wanted to show you." He opened the box to reveal a collection of documents, photographs, and personal items that had belonged to his grandfather, the original architect of the Drake family's corruption. "I've been going through Grandpa's personal effects, and I found some things that I think you should see." Eleanor examined the contents with the same methodical precision she had brought to her original investigation. There were letters from other families involved in the cover-up, business documents that revealed the scope of the conspiracy, and personal diaries that showed how the corruption had affected even those who had perpetrated it. "This is extraordinary," Eleanor said, studying a letter from Marcus Drake Sr. to his son that revealed the psychological toll of maintaining the cover-up. "It shows that even the people who created this system knew it was wrong, knew it was hurting innocent people." Tommy nodded. "I've been thinking about that a lot. How do you live with yourself when you know you're causing harm? How do you justify it to yourself and your family?" Eleanor looked at the young man who had sacrificed everything to expose his family's crimes, who had chosen truth over comfort and justice over loyalty. "I think you justify it by telling yourself that you're protecting something more important than individual lives, that you're serving a greater good that requires difficult sacrifices. But that's not true, is it? The greater good doesn't require covering up murder and environmental crimes." "No, it doesn't. But it's easier to believe that than to face the truth about what you've done and what you've become." They spent the next hour going through the documents, with Eleanor helping Tommy understand the historical context and the connections to other events in Millbrook's history. The process was both educational and therapeutic, helping the young man process his family's legacy while contributing to the ongoing work of healing their community. At 9 a.m., they walked together to the community center, where Eleanor was scheduled to address a group of high school students who were participating in a civic engagement program. The initiative, developed by the Oversight Board, was designed to ensure that the next generation understood both the history of their town and their responsibility to prevent future corruption. The students gathered in the same room where Eleanor had been silenced 18 months earlier, but the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of the resigned passivity that had characterized the original town meeting, the room buzzed with energy and curiosity. These young people had grown up during the investigation and trials, and they understood that civic engagement was both a privilege and a responsibility. "Mrs. Hartwell," said Maria Santos, a 17-year-old whose family had been affected by the contamination, "what made you decide to keep fighting when everyone was telling you to stay quiet?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. I think it was the realization that staying quiet wasn't protecting anyone, except the people who were causing harm. Silence in the face of injustice isn't neutrality, it's complicity. Another student, David Chen, raised his hand. My grandfather died in the factory fire. My family never knew the truth about what happened until your investigation. How do you live with anger like that? You channel it into action, Eleanor replied. You use it to fuel your determination to prevent the same thing from happening to others. Anger can be destructive, but it can also be a powerful force for justice if you direct it properly. The questions continued for an hour, covering everything from research methodology to the emotional challenges of confronting powerful interests. Eleanor was struck by the students' sophistication and their genuine commitment to continuing the work of transformation. After the presentation, Eleanor and Tommy walked through the memorial park, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the newly planted trees. The space had become a gathering place for the community, a symbol of their commitment to remembering the past while building a better future. Mrs. Hartwell, Tommy said as they sat on a bench near the memorial plaque, I've been thinking about something. The investigation you started, the changes we've made, they're important, but they're also fragile. How do we make sure that future generations don't forget what happened here? Eleanor smiled. We do what librarians have always done. We preserve the story, we teach it to others, and we create systems that make it harder for the truth to be buried again. She gestured toward the community center, where the public archives now included all the documents from the investigation, accessible to anyone who wanted to research their town's history. But more importantly, we create a culture where citizens understand that they have both the right and the responsibility to hold their leaders accountable. As the sun set over Millbrook, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The methodical investigation that had started in her study had become something much larger, a template for civic engagement that was being replicated across the country, a reminder that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The phone in her pocket buzzed with a text message from Detective Martinez. Eleanor, we just received confirmation that the federal legislation based on the Millbrook case has passed committee. The Eleanor Hartwell Environmental Justice Act will require transparency in all environmental investigations and protection for whistleblowers who expose contamination cover-ups. Eleanor showed the message to Tommy, who grinned broadly. Your name is going to be on a federal law. That's quite a legacy for someone who was told to stay quiet. It's not my legacy, Eleanor replied. It's our legacy. It belongs to everyone who found the courage to speak out. Everyone who chose truth over comfort. Everyone who refused to let injustice continue. As they walked home through streets that looked the same but felt fundamentally different, Eleanor thought about the letter she had received that morning from the retired teacher in Oregon. Tomorrow, she would begin helping another community fight its own battle against corruption, sharing the lessons learned in Millbrook, and building the network of citizens who refused to stay quiet. The quiet revolution had begun with one woman's refusal to be silenced, but it would continue through the voices of countless others who understood that democracy required active participation, that justice required constant vigilance, and that the truth, once unleashed, had the power to transform not just individual communities, but the entire culture of civic engagement. Eleanor Hartwell's transformation from invisible retiree to catalyst for change was complete, but her impact would echo through generations. The methodical librarian who had been told that old people should stay quiet had proven that sometimes the most powerful voices belong to those who have been overlooked and underestimated. The quiet revolution would continue, one community at a time, one citizen at a time, until the culture of corruption and silence was replaced by transparency and accountability. The legacy was not just in the laws that would be passed or the communities that would be transformed, but in the understanding that ordinary people, armed with determination and evidence, could challenge the most powerful interests and win. The quiet revolution had become a permanent part of American democracy, ensuring that the mistakes of Millbrook would never be repeated, and that the voices of citizens would never again be silenced by those who profited from their silence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,